Okay, one thing that we definitely would need to do here, or want to do here, is set up depth of field. Now, depth of field, of course, speaks to how much of what the camera is looking at is in focus. I mean, that is affected by several different things, mostly the F number here. So the F number is like the pupil of your camera lens. If it's wide open, it can let in a whole bunch of light, but it has a hard time focusing like around the edges and everything. It has a hard time focusing over large distances. If it is closed down tight, it doesn't let as much light in, but it can really focus sharply over a long distance. And it's kind of reverse of what you think sometimes. A higher number means that it's closed down more. So the pupil, the F number, the aperture is what it's called on a camera, is actually getting smaller as the number goes high. It's called stops. So the higher the stops, that means the more it is closed down. Okay, so you can see this represents my depth of field. This plane and this plane. The thing right here on this plane is going to be the most focused, okay? So it's saying you're focused between here and here, and the most focused is right there on that blue, right in the center. So you can see that as I change the F number up, the focus distance goes longer. As I put it way, way down, this is going to let in a ton of light. It could potentially change my exposure, but it also changes the distance over which I can focus. So you can see here, so if I put focus distance, if I turn it on now I can specify exactly what I want to be in focus. So I could either focus on the guitar here, or I can focus on the chair here, and then put the F number, we'll put it somewhere like there, so that for sure this guitar starts getting blurred out, so that our focus becomes on the chair. And things in the foreground will get blurred out as well. Anything outside of this area right here will be blurred. Okay, so this can get you good effects. The lower you put this, the more dramatic the effect's going to be. So maybe we'll put it super, super low, just so we can see the effect. And of course, then we need to put on depth of field. And we need to make sure that this isn't messing up our exposure too. So our exposure wasn't super good before. We had to adjust it in the frame buffer, but let's get it closer, but then also let's make sure that this F number isn't messing with it anymore. The way we can do that, so right now it's set to physical exposure, which means the F number is coming into play, the shutter speed is coming into play, and the film speed is coming into play. All those things are contributing to exposure. And I want to control it so that those things aren't factoring in at all. And we're just saying, you know, regardless of how we're setting all this stuff, I just want this specific exposure. Okay, in real life, it's hard to do that with a camera. It's kind of like auto mode, I guess. But auto mode is different. You'd set the exposure and then all these would adjust accordingly. What we're doing is saying, no matter what we do here, just make the exposure this. Okay, so you can do that here by just saying exposure value instead of physical exposure. So right now, exposure value is set to 8. We can just set it to, let's say, 4. Okay, so you can see what's happening up here. It's kind of doing what auto would do. It's just adjusting the ISO speed to accommodate the exposure I want with my F number set to this and my shutter speed set to that. So you could also set your shutter speed down. And this isn't going to come into play if you don't have any movement in your scene, right? Because shutter speed is how long the aperture is going to be open. The little pupil is going to be open, right? So that determines how much light comes in for your exposure. If it's open longer, it lets in more light. But if it's sitting perfectly still, it's not going to affect anything else. If things were moving, then you'd see them blurring across the screen if you keep the shutter open for too long. But in this case, since everything's sitting perfectly still, it's not going to matter. It's like our camera's on a tripod, right? So it doesn't matter. But that will affect our exposure too. Basically, though, we're setting a target exposure here, and the ISO speed, see, it's grayed out, so it's adjusting to accommodate for these other settings that we have. So long story short, we're setting the target exposure and it's going to give it to us, and we can set our F number to whatever we want and we'll still get the same exposure. So let's just render this real quick and see. And keep in mind, okay, now our exposure is way too high because we have it in the frame buffer and in the camera. Keep in mind that blurring things in your scene using depth of field or any kind of blurring, if it was motion blur or depth of field, anything blurred, and just like glossy reflections, blurred reflections take a long time to render. Depth of field takes a long time to render. Motion blur takes a long time to render. Anything where it's blurring, because it's taking like with motion blur, it's taking several frames and kind of blurring them together. So the main point is that blurring will up your render times. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, you can already see the blurring happening. That guitar, especially that fence in the back, super blurry. And the focus is like right there, right in this area is where it's totally in focus. Even the foreground is a little bit out of focus. So this F number is a little too extreme, right? Because the chair is even looking kind of blurry. Part of it's just that it's taking so long to render. But look back here, you can see this outdoor chair, this pool chair out here just being completely blurred, right? So this is a good way to focus your eye where you want it to go. We still have some issues where this guitar is like really dark and it's just this dark line going through white. And the contrast there is really drawing our eye, which is bad if we don't want to focus on that. So we might have to change our composition a little bit and move things around. But this is a good demonstration of depth of field and exposure settings too. Okay, one thing we need to look at is definitely adjusting our lighting to get something that makes more sense for this. Right now we're just like washing the whole scene with this blue light. One thing is the white balance could be warmer like this, right? So if you're not familiar with the new frame buffer, Vray, I mean, this is not something that we've seen in the course previously, but this is available with the newer V-Rays, and we're going to look at light mix next, which is my favorite feature of the newest V-Rays. But even this is new. So with the old frame buffer, you had sliders for each of these things. Now you can just essentially add different sliders using this, right? So all your different stuff is in here and you can add it, take it away, and you can actually turn it on and off. So actually the exposure should just be turned off entirely because it looks better without it, right? You can see the reflection of that sky all in this chair. So that's a really shiny leather. It might need to be dulled down a little bit. But I turned on that white balance and I adjusted it. You can adjust the tint. And you can also turn it on and off like this. Okay. So everything's kind of the same, but it works a little different. The new frame buffer is so much better. Okay, and we're going to look at light mix, which really, really enhances our control over our renderings. And that's a newer version of V-Ray. And we're going to use that in the frame buffer here as well. So next video, we'll check out light mix. But that is depth of field and how that works.